Welcome, everyone. And today we're going to finish the book of Acts. So if you please turn with me to Acts 21. We've already read the first 20 chapters, and we'll finish Acts 21 through 28 this afternoon. Acts 21. When we had left them behind and had set sail, we made a straight course to Kos and went on the next day to Rhodes and from there to Patara. There we found a ship heading for Phoenicia, and we got on board and set sail. We came in sight of Cyprus, passed it on our left side, sailed to Syria, and arrived in Tyre, which was where the boat was going to unload its cargo. We found some disciples and stayed there a week, and they told Paul by the Spirit not to go to Jerusalem. When our time there was up, we left and went on our way with everyone, women and children included, coming with us out of the city. We knelt down on the seashore and prayed. Then we said our farewells to one another. We got on the ship and they returned home. The end of our voyage from Tyre saw us arrive at Ptolemais. There we greeted the believers and stayed a day with them. On the next day we left and went on to Caesarea and went into the house of Philip the evangelist, one of the seven, and stayed with him. He had 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied. After we'd been there several days, Agabus the prophet arrived from Jerusalem. He came to us, took Paul's girdle, and tied himself up with it, hand and foot. This is what the Holy Spirit says, he declared. The Judeans in Jerusalem will tie up the man to whom this girdle belongs, just like this, and they will hand him over to the Gentiles. When we heard that, we and the people of that place begged Paul not to go up to Jerusalem. Then Paul responded, "What are you doing with all this weeping?" he said, "breaking my heart in pieces. I'm quite prepared not only to be tied up, but to die in Jerusalem for the name of the sovereign Yahshua." When we realized we couldn't dissuade him, we gave up the attempt. "May Yahweh's will be done," was all we said. After those days, we made preparations to go up to Jerusalem. Some of the disciples from Caesarea went with us and took us to the house of Mnason, an elderly disciple from Cyprus. That was where we were going to be staying. For those who just joined, we're in Acts 21. When we came to Jerusalem, the brothers and sisters welcomed us gladly. On the next day, Paul went in with us to see James with all the elders present. He greeted them and laid out before them everything which Yahweh had done through his ministry among the Gentiles, telling it all step by step. They praised Yahweh when they heard it. "You see, brother," they said, "that there are many thousands of Jews who have believed. They are all of them fiercely eager for the law. But what they have heard about you is that you teach all the Jews who live among the nations to abandon Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children and not to keep the customs. Where does this leave us? They will certainly hear that you have come. So do what we tell you. There are 4 men here who have taken a vow upon themselves. Join in with these men, purify yourself along with them, and pay the expenses for them as they have their heads shaved. That way, everyone will know that there is no truth in the accusations against you, but rather that you too are behaving as a law-observant Jew should. As for the Gentiles who have believed, we have written to them with our decision that they should keep themselves from what has been sacrificed to idols, from blood, from what is strangled, and from fornication." So Paul took the men and in the next day underwent the ritual of purification alongside them. He went into the temple and made the declaration, stating when the days of purification would be completed and when the time would come for sacrifice to be offered for each of them. When the 7 days were completed, some Jews from Asia spotted Paul in the temple. They gathered a crowd and grabbed him. "Men of Israel," they yelled, "come and help us. This is the man who's been teaching everybody everywhere against our people, our law, and this place. And now what's more, he's brought some Greeks into the temple, and he's defiled this holy place." They had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian with Paul in the city, and they thought Paul had taken him into the temple. The whole city was stirred up, and people rushed together from all around. They seized Paul and dragged him outside the temple, and the gates were shut at once. As they were trying to kill him, word reached the tribune of the guard that all Jerusalem was in an uproar. At once he took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. When the crowd saw the tribune and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the tribune came up, arrested him, ordered him to be bound with 2 chains, and asked who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd said one thing, some said another. Since he couldn't find out what was really going on because of the uproar, he gave orders for Paul to be brought into the barracks. When they got to the steps, the pressure of the crowd was so strong that the soldiers had to carry Paul. The great mob of people was following and shouting, "Kill him, kill him." As they were about to go into the barracks, Paul turned to the tribune. "Am I allowed to say something to you?" he asked. "Well," replied the tribune, "so you know some Greek, do you? Aren't you the Egyptian who raised a revolt some while back and led those 4,000 assassins into the desert?" "Actually," replied Paul, "I'm a Jew. I'm from Tarsus in Cilicia. That's not an insignificant place to be a citizen of. Please, please let me speak to the people." So he gave him permission. Paul stood on the steps and motioned with his hand to the people. When eventually there was silence, he spoke to them in Hebrew. 22. "My brothers and fathers," he began, "hear me as I explain myself to you." When they heard him speaking in Hebrew, they became even quieter. "I am a Jew," he continued, "and I was born in Tarsus in Cilicia. I received my education here in this city, and I studied at the feet of Gamaliel. I was trained in the strictest interpretations of our ancestral laws and became zealous for Elohim, just as all of you are today. I persecuted this way right to the point of killing people, and I bound and handed over to prison both men and women, as the high priest and all the elders can testify. I received letters from them to the Jews of Damascus, where I was going in order to find the heretics who were there, tie them up, and bring them to Jerusalem to face their just deserts. Just as I was on the way and getting near to Damascus, suddenly a bright light shone from heaven all around me. It was about midday. I fell down on the ground and I heard a voice saying, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?' I answered, 'Who are you, Master?' And he said to me, 'I am Yahshua of Nazareth, and you are persecuting me.' The people who were with me saw the light, but they didn't hear the voice of the person speaking to me. So I said, 'What shall I do, Master?' And the sovereign said to me, 'Get up and go into Damascus, and there you will be informed of all the things that have been arranged for you to do.' So as I couldn't see because of the brightness of that light, the people with me led me by the hand, and I came to Damascus. There was a man named Ananias," Paul continued. "He was a devout, law-keeping Jew, and all the Jews living in Damascus would testify to the fact. He came and stood beside me and said, 'Brother Saul, receive your sight.' In that very moment I could see, and I looked at him. This is what he said: 'The Elohim of our ancestors chose you to know his will, to see the righteous one, and to hear the word from his mouth. This is because you are going to bear witness for him to all people, telling them what you have seen and heard. Now then, what are you going to do? Get up, be baptized, and wash away your sins by calling on his name.' After I came back to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance, and I saw him speaking to me. 'Hurry up,' he said. 'Leave Jerusalem as quickly as possible. They won't accept your testimony about me.' 'But Master,' I replied, 'they themselves know that in all the synagogues I used to imprison and beat those who believe in you. And when they shed the blood of Stephen, your witness, I was myself standing there and giving my approval. I was looking after the cloaks of those who were killing him.' 'No,' he said to me, 'go away from here. I'm sending you far away to the Gentiles.' Up to this point, the crowd listened to Paul, but now they began to shout, 'Away with him from the face of the earth,' they yelled. 'Someone like that has no right to live.' The crowd was shouting, tearing their clothes, and throwing dust in the air. The tribune gave orders for Paul to be brought into the barracks, and he told the guards to examine him by flogging so that he could find out just what was the reason for all the uproar against him. As they were tying Paul up ready for the whips, Paul spoke to the centurion who was standing beside him. 'Is it lawful,' he said, to flog a Roman citizen without first finding him guilty?' When the centurion heard that, he went off to the tribune and spoke to him. 'What do you think you're doing?' he said. 'This fellow's a Roman citizen.' The tribune came and spoke to Paul. 'Tell me,' he said, 'are you a Roman citizen?' 'Yes,' replied Paul. 'It cost me a lot of money to buy this citizenship,' said the tribune. 'Ah,' said Paul, 'but it came to me by birth.' The people who were about to torture Paul stepped back quickly from him. As for the tribune, he was afraid, discovering that he was a Roman citizen and that he had him tied up. On the next day, still wanting to get to the bottom of it all and to find out what was being alleged by the Jews, he released Paul and ordered the chief priests to come together with the whole Sanhedrin. He brought Paul in and presented him to them. 23. Paul looked hard at the Sanhedrin. My brothers, he said, I've conducted myself before Elohim in a completely good conscience all my life up to this day. Ananias the high priest ordered the bystanders to strike Paul on the mouth. Elohim will strike you, you whitewashed wall, said Paul to Ananias. You are sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet you order me to be struck in violation of the law. You are insulting the high priest, asked the bystanders. My brothers, replied Paul, I didn't know he was the high priest. Scripture says, of course, you mustn't speak evil of the ruler of your people. Paul knew that one part of the gathering was Sadducees and the other part Pharisees. My brothers, he shouted to the Sanhedrin, I am a Pharisee, the son of Pharisees. This trial is about the hope, about the resurrection of the dead. At these words, an argument broke out between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and they were split among themselves. The Sadducees deny that there's any resurrection or any intermediate state of angel or spirit, but the Pharisees affirm them both. There was quite an uproar, with some of the scribes in the Pharisees' party standing up and arguing angrily. We find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit spoke to him, or an angel for that matter? Faced with another great riot, the tribune was worried that Paul was going to be pulled in pieces between them. He ordered the guard to go down and snatch him out of the midst of them and bring him back up into the barracks. On the next night, the master stood by him. Cheer up, he said. You have given your testimony about me in Jerusalem. Now you have to do it in Rome. The next morning, the Jews made a plot together. They swore an oath, binding themselves not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 of them who made this solemn vow with one another. They went to the high priest and the elders. We have sworn a solemn and binding oath, they said, not to taste anything until we have killed Paul. What you need to do is this. Tell the tribune with the Sanhedrin to bring him down to you, as if you wanted to make a more careful examination of his case. And then, before he arrives, we'll be ready to dispatch him. Paul's nephew, his sister's son, heard of the plot. He went off, entered the barracks, and told Paul about it. Paul called one of the centurions. Take this young man to the tribune, he said. He's got something to tell him. So he took him off and brought him to the tribune. Paul, the prisoner, called me and asked me to bring this young man to you, he said. Apparently, he's got something to tell you. So the tribune took the young man by the hand and led him off into a private room. What is it you have to tell me, he asked. The Judeans have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the Sanhedrin tomorrow, he said. It will look as if they're wanting to make a more thorough investigation about him, but don't do what they want. There are more than 40 men who are setting an ambush for him, and they've sworn a solemn oath not to eat or drink until they've killed him. They are ready right now, waiting for the word from you. So the tribune dismissed the lad. Don't tell anyone at all that you told me about this, he said. So the tribune summoned 2 of the centurions. Get ready a squad of 200, he said. They're going to Caesarea. Also take 70 horsemen and 200 light armed guards. They leave at 9 o'clock tonight. Get horses ready for Paul to ride and take him safely to Felix the governor. He wrote a letter which went like this. Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greeting. This man was seized by the Jews who were going to kill him. When I learned that he was a Roman citizen, I went with the guard and rescued him. I wanted to know the charge on which they were accusing him, so I took him into their Sanhedrin. There I discovered that he was being accused in relation to disputes about their law, but that he was not being charged with anything for which he would deserve to die or be in prison. I then received information that there was to be a plot against him, so I'm sending him to you at once. I have told his accusers that they must inform you of their charges against him. So the soldiers did what they were told. They took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris, and the next day they allowed the horsemen to go on with him while they returned to the barracks. The company arrived at Caesarea and handed over the letter to the governor, presenting Paul at the same time. Felix read the letter and asked which jurisdiction Paul was from. He found out that he was from Cilicia. I will hear your case, he said, when your accusers arrive. He ordered that he be kept on the guard in Herod's praetorium. Chapter 24. After 5 days, Ananias the high priest came down to Caesarea with some of the elders and with a barrister named Tertullus. They told the governor what they had against Paul. Paul was summoned, and Tertullus began his speech of accusation. Most excellent Felix, we are enjoying great peace because of you. Through your wise foresight and planning, things have greatly improved for this people. We welcome it in every way, in every place, and with every feeling of gratitude. But so as not to keep you waiting any longer, I beg you of your forbearance to listen to us briefly. We find this fellow to be a public nuisance. He stirs up civil strife among all the Jews all over the world. He's a ringleader in the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to defile the temple, but we caught him. If you examine him yourself, you'll be able to find out about all these things of which we're accusing him. The Jews added their voices to the speech, agreeing that it was just as had been said. The governor motioned for Paul to speak. I understand that you have been governor of this nation for several years, he began, and therefore I am all the more pleased to make my defense before you. You will be able to discover that it is not more than 12 days since I came up to worship at Jerusalem. They didn't find me disputing with anybody in the temple, nor was I stirring up a crowd, either in the synagogues or elsewhere in the city. They can provide no proof of any of the charges they are now bringing against me. But this much I will confess to you, that it is true that I do worship the Elohim of my ancestors according to the way which they call a sect. I believe everything which is written in the law and the prophets, and I hold to the hope in Elohim, for which they also long, that there will be a resurrection of the righteous and the unrighteous. For that reason, I make it my settled aim always to have a clear conscience before Elohim and all people. For several years, I've been collecting alms and offerings to bring to my nation. That was the business I was engaged in when they found me purified in the temple, without any crowds and without any riot. There was some Jewish from Asia there. They are the ones who should appear before you and bring any accusations against me that they may have. Or let these people themselves say what wrong they found in me when I stood before the Sanhedrin. Unless it is about this one thing, which I shouted out as I was standing among them, it's because of the resurrection of the dead that I am being judged before you today. Felix was quite well informed about the way. He adjourned the hearing. When Lysias, the tribune, comes down, he says, "Then I will make my decision about your business." He told the centurion to keep Paul under guard, to allow him some freedom, and not to stop any of his companions from looking after him. After some days, Paul came with Drusilla, his wife, who was Jewish. They sent for Paul and listened to him speaking about faith in the Messiah Yahshua. As he talked about justice, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix became afraid. "That's quite enough for now," he said. "You can go. When I get a good opportunity, I'll call for you again another time." At the same time, he was hoping that Paul would give him money, and so he sent for him frequently and talked with him. After 2 years, Felix handed over the reins of office. 2 years. Felix handed over the reins of office to Porcius Festus. He wanted to do the Jews a favor, and so he left Paul in prison. 25. So Festus arrived in the province, and after 3 days, he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. The high priests and the leading men of the Jews appeared before him, laying charges against Paul and putting a request to him. They wanted him to do a special favor for them and against Paul by sending for him to be brought up to Jerusalem. They were making a plan to kill him on the way. But Festus answered that he was keeping Paul at Caesarea and that he himself would shortly be going back there. So he said, "Your officials should come down with me. They can put any accusations of wrongdoing they may have against the man." He stayed with them for a few days, about 8 or 10, and then went down to Caesarea. On the next day, he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought to him. When he appeared, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem surrounded him and hurled many serious accusations at him, which they were not able to substantiate. Paul made his response, "I have offended neither against the Jews' law, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar." Festus, however, wanted to do a favor to the Jews. "Tell me," he said to Paul in reply, "how would you like to go up to Jerusalem and be tried by me there about these things?" "I am standing before Caesar's tribunal," said Paul, "which is where I ought to be tried. I've done no wrong to the Jews, as you well know. If I've committed any wrong, or if I've done something which means I deserve to die, I'm not trying to escape death. But if I have done none of the things that they're accusing me of, nobody can hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar." Festus consulted with his advisors. "You have appealed to Caesar," he said, "and to Caesar you shall go." After some days, King Agrippa came to Caesarea with Bernice to greet Festus. They spent several days there, and during that time, Festus put to the king the whole matter of Paul and the case against him. I have a man here, he said, who was left by Felix as a prisoner. When I was up in Jerusalem, the chief priests and the Jewish elders came before me and asked me to pass sentence on him. My response was that it is not our Roman custom to hand anyone over until the accused has had a chance to look his accusers in the face and make a defense against the charges. So they came down here, and I didn't postpone the business, but sat in court the next day and commanded the man to be brought. His accuser stood there and brought charges, but none of the sort of wrongdoing I had been expecting. It turned out to have to do with various wranglings concerning their own religion and about some dead man called Yahshua, whom Paul asserted was alive. I simply didn't know what to do about all this dispute, and so I asked him if he would like to go up to Jerusalem and be judged there about these things. But Paul then appealed for his case to be sent up to his majesty, so I gave the order that he should be kept under guard until I could send him to Caesar. I should like to hear this man for myself, said Agrippa to Festus. Very well, said Festus. You shall do so tomorrow. On the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great ceremony and entered the audience chamber. With them came the tribunes and the leading men of the city. Festus gave the order, and Paul was brought in. King Agrippa, said Festus, and all of you assembled here, you see this man. The whole multitude of the Jews appealed to me about him, both in Jerusalem and here. They shouted that it wasn't right to let him live. But I found that he had done nothing to deserve death. And since he then himself appealed to his majesty, I decided to send him. I don't have anything definite to write to our sovereign master about him, so I brought him here to you, and particularly before you, King Agrippa, so that I may know what to write once we have had a judicial hearing. There seems no sense to me in sending a prisoner without giving some indication of the charges against him. Chapter 26. Agrippa addressed Paul. You are permitted, he said, to speak for yourself. Paul stretched out his hand and began his defense. I consider myself blessed, King Agrippa, he said, to have the chance to speak before you today in my defense concerning all the things which the Jews have charged me. In particular, because I know you are an expert on all matters of Jewish customs and disputes. I beg you, therefore, to give me a generous hearing. All the Jews know my manner of life. I lived from my earliest days among my own people and in Jerusalem. They have known already for a long time, if they are willing to testify, that I lived as a Pharisee, according to the strictest sect of our religion. And now I stand accused because of the hope of the promise made by Elohim to our ancestors, the hope for which our 12 tribes wait with earnest longing in their worship night and day. And it is this hope, O king, for which I am now accused by the Jews. Why should any of you judge it unbelievable that Elohim would raise the dead? I thought I was under obligation to do many things against the name of Yahshua of Nazareth, and that is what I did in Jerusalem. I received authority from the chief priests to shut up many of Yahweh's people in prison. And when they were condemned to death, I cast my vote against them. I punished them many times in all the synagogues and forced many of them to blaspheme. I became more and more furious against them and even pursued them to cities in other lands. While I was busy on this work, Paul continued, I was traveling to Damascus with authority and commission from the chief priests. Around midday, while I was on the road, O king, I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the light of the sun, and shining all around me and my companions on the road. We all fell to the ground, and I heard a voice speaking to me in Hebrew. Saul, Saul, he said, why are you persecuting me? It's hard for you. This is kicking against the goads. Who are you, master? I said. I am Yahshua, said the master, and you are persecuting me. But get up and stand on your feet. I'm going to tell you why I have appeared to you. I'm going to establish you as a servant, as a witness both of the things you have already seen and of the occasions I will appear to you in the future. I will rescue you from the people and from the nations to whom I am going to send you, so that you can open their eyes to enable them to turn from darkness to light and from the power of the Satan to Elohim, so that they can have forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who are made holy by their faith in me. So then, King Agrippa, I didn't disobey this vision from heaven. I preached that people should repent and turn to Yahweh and do the works that demonstrate repentance. I preached it first to those in Damascus, then also in Jerusalem, in the whole countryside of Judea, and among the nations. That is the reason the Jews seized me in the temple and tried to slaughter me. But I have had help from Elohim right up to this very day. And so I stand here to bear witness, to small and great alike, of nothing except what the prophets and Moses too said would happen, namely that the Messiah would suffer, that he would be the first to rise from the dead, and that he would proclaim light to the people and to the nations. As Paul was making his defense in this way, Festus roared out at the top of his voice, "Paul, you're mad. All this learning of yours has driven you crazy." "I'm not mad, most excellent Festus," responded Paul. "On the contrary, I'm speaking words full of truth and good sense. The king knows about these things, and it is to him that I am speaking so boldly. I cannot believe that any of this has escaped his notice. After all, these things didn't happen in a corner. Do you believe the prophets, King Agrippa? I know you believe them." Paul was an operator. He really knew what he was doing. "You reckon you're going to make me a believer then," said Agrippa to Paul, "and pretty quick too by the sound of it." "Whether quick or slow," replied Paul, "I pray to Elohim that not only you, but also all who hear me today will become just as I am, apart, of course, from these chains." The king, the governor, and Bernice, and those sitting with them got up. As they were going away, they talked to one another about it. "This man," they were saying, "has done nothing to deserve death or chains." And Agrippa commented to Festus, "This man could have been set free if only he hadn't gone and appealed to Caesar." Chapter 27. When it was decided that we should sail to Italy, they handed Paul over, along with some other prisoners, to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial cohort. They got into a ship from Andromedium that was intending to sail to various places along the coast of Asia. So off we set. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, came too. Next day we put in at Sidon. Julius was kind to Paul and allowed him to go to his friends to be cared for. When we left Sidon, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us, and then crossed the sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, arriving at Myra in Lycia. There, the centurion found a ship going from Alexandria to Italy, and we got on board. After a few days, we were making very heavy weather of it, and only got to the shore at Cnidus. Since the wind was not helping us, we sailed under the lee of Crete, off the coast from Salmon. Getting past that point with some difficulty, we came to a place which is called Fair Havens, not far from the town of Lycia. Quite a bit of time had now elapsed, and sailing was becoming dangerous. The fast had already come and gone. Paul gave his advice. "Men," he said, "I can see we're going to have trouble on this voyage. It's going to be dangerous. We may well sustain heavy losses, both to the cargo and to the ship, not to mention to human life." But the centurion put his faith in the helmsman and the ship owner rather than in what Paul had said. Unfortunately, the harbor was not suitable for wintering in, so most people were in favor of going on from there to see if they could get to Phoenix, a harbor on Crete, which faces both southwest and northwest. They would then be able to spend the winter there. Well, a moderate southerly breeze sprang up, and they thought they had the result they wanted. So they lifted the anchor and sailed along, hugging the shore of Crete. But before long, a great typhoon, they called it Eurocylon, the northeaster, swept down from Crete. Yeah, we know what those are like. And the ship was caught up by it. Since the ship couldn't turn and face into the wind, it had to give way, and we were carried along. When we came in behind an island called Cauda, we were just able to get the ship's boat under control. They pulled it up and did what was necessary to undergird the ship. We're currently in Acts 27. Then, because they were afraid that we would crash into the Syrtis sandbanks, they lowered the sea anchor and allowed the ship to be driven along. The storm was so severe that on the next day they began to throw cargo overboard. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard as well with their own hands. We then went for a good many days without seeing either the sun or the stars, with a major storm raging. All hope of safety was finally abandoned. We'd gone without food a long time. Then Paul stood up in the middle of them all. It does seem to me, my good people," he said, "that you should have taken my advice not to leave Crete. We could have managed without this damage and loss, but now I want to tell you, take heart. No lives will be lost, only the ship. This last night, you see, an angel of the Elohim to whom I belong and whom I worship stood beside me. Don't be afraid, Paul," he said. "You must appear before Caesar. And let me tell you this, Elohim has granted you all your traveling companions. So take heart, my friends. I believe Elohim that it will be as he has said to me. We must, however, be cast up on some island or other." On the 14th night, we were being carried across the Sea of Adria, when around the middle of the night, The sailors reckoned that they were getting near some land. They took soundings and found 20 fathoms. Then a little bit further, they took soundings again and found 15 fathoms. They were afraid that we might crash into a rocky place, so they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. The sailors wanted to escape from the ship and let down the boat into the sea under the pretense of going to put out anchors from the bow. But Paul spoke to the centurions and the soldiers. If these men don't stay in the ship, he said, there's no chance of safety. Then the soldiers cut the ropes of the boat and let it fall away. When it was nearly daytime, Paul urged all of them to eat something. It's now all of 14 days, he said, that you've been hanging on without food, not eating a thing. So let me encourage you to have something to eat. This will help you get rescued. No hair of any of your heads will be lost. So saying, he took some bread, gave thanks to Elohim in front of them all, broke the bread and ate it. Then all of them cheered up and took some food. The whole company on board was 276. When we had eaten enough food, they threw the grain overboard to lighten the ship. When they came, they didn't recognize the land. It appeared to have a bay with a sandy shore, and that was where they hoped, if possible, to beach the ship. They let the anchors drop away into the sea, and at the same time slackened the rope on the rudders, hoisting the foresail and headed for the beach. But they crashed to a reef and ran the ship aground. The prow stuck fast and wouldn't budge. While the strong waves were smashing the stern to bits, the soldiers planned to kill the prisoners so that none of them would swim away and escape. But the centurion wanted to rescue Paul and refused permission for them to carry out their intention. Instead, he ordered all who were able to swim to leap overboard first and head for land, while the rest were to come after, some on boards and some on bits and pieces of the ship. And so everyone ended up safely on land. In chapter 28, when we reached safety, we discovered that the island was called Malta. The local inhabitants treated us with unusual kindness. They set to and built a fire for us all since it was cold and had started to rain. Paul had collected quite a bundle of brushwood and was putting it on the fire when a viper, escaping the heat, fastened onto his hand. The natives saw the animal clinging to his hand. Aha, they said to one another, this man must be a murderer. He's been rescued from the sea, but justice hasn't allowed him to live. Paul, however, shook off the snake into the fire and suffered no harm. They kept watching him to see if he would swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But when they had waited and watched for quite some time, and nothing untoward had happened to him, they changed their minds. He must be a god, they said. Publius, the leading man of the island, owned lands in the region where we were. He welcomed us and entertained us in a most friendly fashion for 3 days. Publius's father was lying sick in bed with a fever and with dysentery. Paul went in to see him and prayed. Then he laid his hands on him and cured him. At this, everyone else on the island who was sick came and was cured. They gave us many honors, and when we were getting ready to sail away, they gave us everything we needed. After 3 months, we set sail on a ship that had been spending the winter on the island. It was from Alexandria and had the insignia of the Heavenly Twins. We arrived at Syracuse and stayed 3 days. From there, we raised anchor and sailed across to Rhegium. After 1 day there, a south wind arose, and on the 2nd day, we arrived at Puteoli, where we found believers who encouraged us to stay with them for 7 days. And so we came to Rome. Believers from there, hearing about us, came to meet us as far as Appian Forum and 3 taverns. When Paul saw them, he thanked Yahweh and took heart. When we arrived in Rome, Paul was allowed to lodge privately. He had a soldier to guard him. After 3 days, Paul called together the leading men of the Jews. When they arrived, he began to speak. My brothers, he said, I've done nothing against our people or our ancestral customs. Yet I was made a prisoner in Jerusalem and handed over to the Romans. The Romans put me on trial and wanted to let me go because they couldn't find me guilty of any capital crime. But the Judeans opposed this and forced me to appeal to Caesar. This had nothing to do with my bringing any charges against my nation. So that's why I've asked to see you and talk with you. It is because of the hope of Israel, you see, that I am wearing this chain. For our part, they responded, we haven't received any letters about you from Judea, nor has anyone of our nation come here to tell us anything or to say anything bad about you. We want to hear from your own lips what you have in mind. However, as for this new sect, the one thing we know is that people everywhere are speaking out against it. So they fixed a day and came in large numbers to Paul's lodgings. He spoke to them and gave his testimony about the kingdom of Yahweh. From morning to night, he explained to them the things about Yahshua from the law of Moses and the prophets. Some were persuaded by what he said, and others did not believe. They disagreed among themselves. So as they were getting ready to leave, Paul said one last thing. The Holy Spirit, he said, spoke truly through the prophet Israel to your ancestors when he said, go to this people and say to them, listen and listen, but never hear. Look and look, but never see. For this people's heart has grown dull, and their ears are dim with hearing. And they have closed their eyes so that they might not see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their heart and turn, and I would heal them. Let it then be known to you that this salvation from Yahweh has been sent to the Gentiles, so they will listen. Paul lived there for 2 whole years at his own expense and welcomed everyone who came to see him. He announced the kingdom of Yahweh and taught the things about the sovereign Yahshua the Messiah with all boldness and with no one stopping him. And we have completed the book of Acts. A lot of great stuff here. Like I said, the book of Acts is one of my favorite, if not my favorite, book in all the scripture, actually. Just chock full of information, and it's just, it reads like a movie to me, with a very definite first, second, and third act. And the thing that, whenever we're interpreting a biblical book, the thing that you always want to look for is what in methodical Bible study we refer to as a key center. And there are there's no hard and fast rule about a key center. If you ask 10 different people, you might get 9 different answers, right? But for me, a potential key center, although there may be 2 or 3 that I would offer, is actually the very last verse. That it says, speaking about Paul, it says in Acts 28:31, he announced the kingdom of Yahweh and taught the things about the sovereign Yahshua the Messiah with all boldness and with no one stopping him. And to me, that characterizes the entire book of Acts, and everything that's kind of radiates out from that. That's exactly what Paul did. That was his mission. It was his mission to proclaim the kingdom of Yahweh, right? And as I've been explaining for the last couple of weeks, the message of the kingdom of Yahweh is the message that Yahshua has inaugurated his kingdom, and that we as the assembly, up until the present day, are proclaiming to the world that kingdom is in place, and that we are demonstrating through our lives as ambassadors of that kingdom. We are demonstrating what that kingdom is supposed to be like. And what does that look like? Well, it looks like what you see in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5-7, right? It looks like taking care of the poor. It looks like giving honor and glory to Yahweh and to his word. It looks like, being the first to speak against injustice. It looks like, being people of grace and compassion and of mercy. It has to do with relieving oppression, right? Yahshua went about relieving people of illness and also relieving them of demon attacks, right? It's about giving unconditional love, of demonstrating agape in action. That word agape meaning an unconditional love that's not seeking something in return. There are many different passages in scripture that describe the kingdom of Yahweh, and by the grace of Yahweh, I will do studies fully about the kingdom of Yahweh in the future. But you constantly see Yahshua describing that kingdom, and it constantly overturns expectations. So if you go over, for example, to Mark chapter 10, you have an interesting situation where the sons of Zebedee, James and John, are asking what typical followers of a future king might ask, right? Except that they weren't at that time getting the picture. So I'm in Mark 10, verse 35. Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. Teacher, they said, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. What do you want me to do for you? He asked. They replied, let one of us sit at your right hand and the other at your left in your glory. You don't know what you're asking, Yahshua said. Can you drink the cup I drink or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with? We can, they answered. Yahshua said to them, you will drink the cup I drink and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with, but to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. Those places belong to those for whom they have been prepared. When the 10 heard about them, in other words, the other folks, they became indignant with James and John. Yahshua called them together and said, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles, of the nations, the word Gentiles means the nations, lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you, not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all, servant of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And of course, we remember John 13 that we read typically around Passover, unleavened bread time. We see this as well as Yahshua engaged in the foot washing, where he showed that here I am, a king, and I'm stooping, I'm bending, so that, in humility, right, to wash your feet, to serve. So he's saying to them at every turn, this is what people say that a kingdom is like. And they're looking for some grand entrance. They're looking for, all the trappings of worldly kings and displays of power, right? But not so with you, right? He keeps trying to drive it into them that Yahweh's kingdom is different. Yahweh's kingdom does not look like the vision that the nations have of their kingdom, where everything is splendor and glory and war and violence and power over people, right? That's not the way that Yahweh's kingdom is established, you see. He's trying to show them at every turn, it's different. It's a way of peace, of love, of compassion. It's not going to be done. It's not going to be achieved through violence and through displays of power and strength in that way. Yes, it's going to be power and strength, but not the power and strength that human beings are used to. It's the power and strength that Yahweh demonstrates, which is the power manifested first and foremost in love. And that's not in some psychobabblish way that we're talking here, right? We're talking about genuine love and people looking out for one another, in relieving suffering and relieving oppression. That's where the true power lies, you see. So everywhere you turn, he's describing it, right? So if you go to Matthew 13, Yahshua, he's describing different aspects of the kingdom. The entirety of Matthew 13 is describing what the kingdom is like, right? So just give you a few examples. So verse 11, because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom has been given to you, but not to them. The knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom. I'm explaining to you what the kingdom is like, you see. And then he says in all his parables, verse 24, for example, Yahshua told him another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field, blah, 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 right? Verse 31, he told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. I shouldn't say blah, blah, blah. That's not exactly what I mean, but you know what I mean. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field, etc. Let's put it that way. Then verse 33, the kingdom of heaven is like yeast, leavening, that a woman took, etc. And everywhere, right? The kingdom of heaven is like this. The kingdom of heaven is like that. The kingdom of heaven is like that. And by the way, that term kingdom of heaven, as I've emphasized in the past, it's not referring to the kingdom being in heaven. It's referring to the source of the kingdom, that it proceeds from heaven. The kingdom of heaven is uniquely a term in the book of Matthew, because Matthew was speaking to Jews who were not at that time accustomed to using the name of Yahweh publicly. So whereas you have other gospels that are using the kingdom of Yahweh, Matthew doesn't use it because he's speaking predominantly to Hebrews, to Jews, and he was, being sensitive to the fact that they weren't using the name of Yahweh. But that's what is essentially, it's the equivalent of kingdom of Yahweh in the other gospels. So this is the essence of the book of Acts. It's Paul going around teaching the kingdom of Yahweh and the new creation, right? That's what we're talking about here, is new creation. The kingdom is new creation. It is a restoration of the Edenic condition. And it began when Yahshua died and was resurrected. As I said a number of times, the resurrection, the day of the resurrection, was the day that a revolution began. And that revolution was to turn the kingdoms of the world upside their head. And it's going to come to fruition when Yahshua returns. It's kind of what you see in the book of Daniel, right? Where Daniel 7:13. In my vision at night, Daniel says, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. Like I said last week, it's a reversal of the Tower of Babel. And you see it coming to fruition on the day of Pentecost, when there are representatives from all the nations who are there present. And it says here in Daniel 7:14, he, the Ancient of Days, he was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed, you see. And then you think about the vision given to Daniel about Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2, a few chapters back. And same thing, he explains, and we don't have time to go through all the different elements of the statue. But the last part of the statue is the final beast system, that is the government, the beast government that is aligned against Yahweh's people. And then it says down in verse 41, just as you saw, this is Daniel giving the interpretation of the vision, just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom, that last government, human government, yet it will have some of the strength of iron in it, in other words, the strength of Rome, even as you saw iron mixed with clay. As the toes were partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. In the time of those kings, the Elohim of heaven will set up a kingdom. Actually says in the language there in the Aramaic, it says the Elah of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of a mountain, but not by human hands, a rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces, you see. So this is described as a mountain that fills the whole earth. So if you look in the book of Isaiah, the book of Micah, and they describe the mountain of Yahweh's rule there in Zion, you see. So just a few other things in the book of Acts. So the theme of the kingdom is heavy throughout. Also, this whole situation with regard to the law of Yahweh, right? And how people misinterpret what's being described with regard to the law. So I want to maybe just show you something here. Give me a second and see if I could find it. So just bear with me. No, you can keep it going. Okay, so let me just pull a couple of things up and then I'll explain it to you. So just bear with me, okay? And this would take a lot more than just a few minutes to go into any depth, but I do want to share a couple of things with you. Okay, that's one, and then okay. One more thing, and I'll be right there. Okay, So when you look in the book of Acts and you see a description of the various elements of the law, and you have people who are saying all the time that the law has been done away with, I strongly feel that the misinterpretation that is being given of that is because of a misunderstanding of the difference between the written law, the written Torah, and the oral law, the oral Torah, which in the minds of the Jewish sages and teachers, there was no difference. So you had the written Torah, which is the Torah that you see here described in the Bible, right? And then you have many, many oral traditions that are presumably commentary on the written Torah, interpretation or policies that are developed, that have been developed over centuries to be able to enact the written Torah. So when Yahshua talked about the traditions of the elders, for example, he was referring to the oral Torah. So if you turn with me to Mark chapter 7, it says, this is Mark 7, it says, the Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had gathered from Jerusalem gathered around Yahshua and saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash, and they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Yahshua, why don't your disciples live according to the traditions of the elders instead of eating their food with defiled hands? So when people look at the traditions of the elders, this is the equivalent of what you see in a number of passages of scripture in the context in which they're written, what is referred to as the law or as the works of the law. So in the Greek in particular, there's no distinguishing. So if you see the word nomos, law, everyone says, oh, law, well, that's the Torah. That's, that's the 5 books of Moses. No, it isn't. People forget that Paul was a Pharisee, right? So if you hold your place in Mark 7 and you go to Philippians 3, we know that Paul, by training, was a Pharisee, right? He said it in the book of Acts. I was a Pharisee and I received training according to all the aspects of the law. Matter of fact, you don't have to go there, just listen. So when he's explaining his history to the governor, right, he says, let's see if I can find it. He says in Acts 23, 7, excuse me. Yeah, 6 for context. Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, my brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead. And he was doing it to cause the ruckus, right? Which he did. But he was, in fact, a Pharisee. So in Philippians 3, he confirms that, right? Verse 5. He's talking about himself, circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, in regard to the law, a Pharisee, right? So Paul, he was trained to speak and to argue in the manner of the Pharisees. The Pharisees were they were a political party, but they were a populist party. The Sadducees were kind of the aristocrats who maintained the temple in its precinct. But the Pharisees were more populist, with governing the day-to-day interactions with the people. And they were like lawyers in the way that they talked, and the way that they studied, and the way that they spoke. So they had the manner of the diatribe in terms of explaining, question, answer, and giving different opinions. And Paul was schooled in that way. So the way that he writes is in many ways the way that he used to learn and the way that he used to teach as a Pharisee. So he had a very legally oriented mind, is my point. And he would speak in terms that were not always readily understood. So he would speak about the works of the law, and it meant something in the context of the people to whom he was speaking. You see that explained the term works of the law, particularly in the book of Galatians, which is one of the most misunderstood books that you can find in all the scripture. So when you look at something like the works of the law, that's a term of art. It's a very specific term that means something, and I believe it has to do directly with what you see in a place like Mark 7, when you're talking about the traditions of the elders, otherwise known as the takanot. In other words, oral law, oral traditions that came to be associated with the Torah as policies, interpretations, commentary on that Torah. So when Paul refers to, you have to look at the context of the writing that you're examining at the moment. And sometimes it's not entirely clear, because let's face it, we're here thousands, literally 2,000 years removed from Paul in his time. And so, because of the way that the writings were preserved and the way that they were handed down, because of interpretations and translations and all kinds of related issues, we're seeing only part of the picture. I'm not saying that the scriptures themselves are not complete, but we're coming in on one part of the conversation. It's kind of like if you're trying to get all of your facts and make your determinations on the basis of being on one side of a telephone conversation. If I were here talking to my wife and I'm on the phone and she hears me talking to a colleague from work, she's going to have some sense of what I'm speaking about, right? Because of the way that I'm responding to the person on the other end of the phone. But she's not going to have all the facts, all the details, all the nuance that she needs to know precisely what I'm talking about. And so is with the writings of Paul. Paul is addressing in his letters very specific things that are going on in these assemblies that he has helped to set up. And the fact is, we're simply not fully aware of the precise nature of every one of those questions that was brought before Paul that precipitated those letters. So therefore, we're only getting part of the picture. So we have to do a lot of assuming, we have to do a lot of interpolation and interpretation to make sure that we're understanding what he's saying. But I think that we have enough to understand that he's not talking about the written Torah, because it's not consistent with the things that he's talking about. Okay. Now, why am I making that distinction? So this is where I'll share my screen with you for a couple of minutes here. Please understand that the Jews in Paul's day did not make a distinction between written Torah and oral Torah. So if you look at a tractate like something called Pirkei Avot, which is loosely translated as the ethics or the sayings of the fathers, it's part of what's called the Mishnah, which is part of the Talmud. The Pirkei Avot is what's called tractate of the Mishnah, and I hope I'm saying that right. And the introduction ties all of the law in its totality in the mind of Jewish sages to Moses. Can everybody see the screen, by the way? Okay, so this is the very beginning, the introduction of the Pirkei Avot. It says, Moses received the Torah at Sinai and transmitted it to Yahshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. That's the men of the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. And they said three things: be patient in the administration of justice, raise many disciples, and make a fence around the Torah. And this is part of the problem, right? Make a fence around the Torah to protect the Torah, but yet the Torah itself is supposed to be the fence, right? But that's an issue for another day. But the bottom line is they're claiming Mosaic authority for a Torah that has been transmitted all the way down to the present time to the men of the great assembly. And then that would be, of course, in the minds of Jewish scholars to the present day, right? Or Jewish religious people to the present day. But we're just talking about up to Paul's day at this moment, right? So when he talks about Torah, they're talking about not just written Torah. If you keep reading down here, and I won't read through all this, but they'll say something like this: Yosef ben Yoezer, a man of Zereda, and Yosef ben Yohanan, a man of Jerusalem, received the oral tradition from them, right? And you see that phrase here many times, the oral tradition, right? Because that oral tradition is considered to be part of this Torah. So there's no distinction made. When they say he received the Torah, they mean he received the written law, the written Torah, and the oral Torah, the what they call the Torah be'al pei, mouth, the Torah of the mouth, and the Torah bichtav, which is the written Torah. Same thing in their mind. They both came from the same source, and he transmitted it all the way through the present day. And then I'd like you to take a look at here. to something called the Mishnah Torah. The Mishnah Torah is a code of Jewish religious law authorized by Maimonides. So let me just show you the beginning of the Mishnah Torah, if I can find it quickly here. Okay, there's a better translation that I had a little while ago, so just bear with me a moment. Mishneh Torah, let's say Mishneh Torah English. This will be the last thing because we're already coming upon an hour here. Okay, so here's what it says. The complete restatement of the oral law, Mishneh Torah. And it says, all of the commandments that were given to Moshe at Sinai, this is what it said in the Pirkei Avot, right? All the commandments that were given to Moshe at Sinai were given together with their interpretation, as it is written, and I will give you the tables of stone and the law and the commandment. And then he references Exodus 24, where he says, then their interpretation is law, is the written law, and commandment is its interpretation. We were commanded to fulfill the law according to the commandment, and this commandment is what is called the oral law. The whole of the law was written down by Moshe, our teacher, before he died in his own hand. He gave a scroll of the law to each tribe, etc., etc. Verse 3, but the commandment, which is the interpretation of the law, he did not write it down, but gave orders concerning it to the elders, to Yahshua, and to all the rest of Israel, as it is written, all this word which I command you, that shall you observe to do. For this reason is called the oral law. Although the oral law was not written down, Moshe, our teacher, taught all of it in his court to the 70 elders, etc. Our teacher, Moshe, our teacher, passed on the oral law and ordered him concerning it, and on and on and on, right? Now, these writings were codified way after Paul and his people, but these are all oral traditions that existed way before Paul. So my point here, I think, is obvious, right? My point is that when they're talking about the law, the Torah, or the works of the law, they're not referring to the written Torah. And there are examples of that, Mark 7 being one of them, right? So when they say that the Pharisees, I'm back in Mark 7, the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing. And then the Pharisees say to Yahshua, why aren't your disciples keeping the tradition of the elders? That's actually pretty accurate. They could have said, why aren't they keeping the Torah? They could have easily substituted that word. Instead, they say tradition of the elders, because that's exactly right. It's those interpretations that are viewed with the same authority as the written Torah, because in their mind, there's no distinction, because all of it came from Moses, you see, which we know is not true, because many of those oral traditions, obviously, are not consistent with the written Torah. And I can go into a whole litany of rationales and proofs of that, right? But that's not necessary. Even this year, right? You don't find anything about a ceremonial hand washing in the Torah. Now, you do find that in the temple and the tabernacle before that the priests would wash their hands, but that's not this. This is something very explicit that where do you find this? You will find this in Jewish law, but not in written Torah law in the Bible. You find it in Jewish law for sure, right? And then if you want a little bit more explanation, Yahshua answers them in verse 6. He replied, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites, as it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. I don't really like this NIV translation. That what it says in most versions is that they worship me following the traditions of men, you see. You have let go of the commands of Elohim and are holding on to human traditions. And then he goes on, you have a fine way of setting aside the commandments of Yahweh in order to observe your own traditions. That is at the heart of all the problems that Paul had with regard to the works of the law. So I could go on and on about that, but I think that I'm making my point with that. In any event, there's much more that could be said about the book of Acts. I hope you enjoyed the reading of it. And I hope that you, like I said, obviously it would take a long time to go through all the different themes of the book of Acts, but hopefully this gives you a little bit of